Guys, welcome officially. We are starting our webinar with Raphael Cormack. Welcome, Raphael, and thank you for being here. Okay, so this is the first thing. I would love to say how grateful I am for this opportunity to discuss your book, to discuss the golden era, to dive into a very special angle that you decided to approach this time period in Egypt. So this is the first thing. Thank you and welcome. Okay.
Yeah,
now,
thanks
before
for
you share a few images you have, and before we start diving into the book and the aspects that I consider the most interesting, of course, this is very relative and it's personal. You know, different people will read it differently and see different points of interest. I'm an Oriental dancer. I've lived in Egypt for a long time. I've performed. So a lot of what you tell in this book, I can recognize it. So I have a very particular way of reading and feeling the book. All right. So obviously I'm coming from that point. All right. From someone who has been in these places, who has lived in this mentality, who has gone through the places that you describe, some of them that still exist, etc. Now, tell us a little bit about yourself. How do you define yourself and how do you get to Egypt? How does the interest for Egypt is born? So let's start there.
Yes, well, yeah, I guess I first started getting interested in Egypt because I wanted to learn Arabic, and I'd actually been to Khartoum in Sudan, which is a fantastic place. I really liked it, got interested in Arabic, sort of started learning it a little bit, and then it turned out that Egypt really was one of the best places to go to learn there. So I did a few courses there, eventually went to the American University, did a year-long course. And as I was there, so I come at this from a slightly different angle to you. I come from a more of a theater sort of background. So part of the reason why it's so good to talk to you and perhaps other people on this call who are dancers is I'd really like to hear what you have to say about the whole dance aspect of it. I mean, in my view, it's very difficult to separate really what theater, dance, and song in this period.
Sure, you know, I'm an actress. I did a conservatory in acting, so I was supposed to be an actress, but then that's another story. So let me go even before. So why the interest for the Arabic language then?
I mean, I think it's really, I enjoyed learning languages. I enjoyed going to Sudan, and I went to Cairo for a little bit to sort of see what it was like. And then Cairo really captured me as a city. I mean,
what captured you?
I mean, it's one of these cities where I think it's you kind of, you're either totally put off by it on the beginning or you're totally overwhelmed by it. And I was in the sort of latter category. And I went there first in 2009. And then so being there 2009, 10, 11, 12, etc. It was a really kind of amazing time to be there. And I don't want to sort of discount how important that moment was for my love of Cairo and kind of because it's a very difficult city to live in by any stretch of the imagination. But meeting people, all the people around in the Arab Spring and afterwards, I think that really made me very kind of attached to the city. And I think it's a city that you could get very attached to, despite all of its difficulties.
I mean, I always like to know when a guest has been in Egypt for a while or has a particular interest. I'm always curious because I have my own love affair with Cairo. I lived there for 8 years. Even before I had traveled there many times by myself, all over Egypt, not only Cairo. So I know very well why, for me, Cairo is the best city in the world. It's the most fascinating, richest, dynamic city, hands down. But I'm always curious to know what attracts other people and what attracts other people to this part of the world, to this language, to this culture, to this history, which are so specific. Hence my question.
Yeah.
Very good. And what about the book? Even before you show us the images that I believe are connected with the book, right?
Yeah.
What about this book? What made you feel or think, I want to write something about the golden era of Egypt? What was
It,
the hook?
well, that then came out of, I suppose, after living in Cairo for a while, and perhaps an attempt to live in Cairo for longer. I started a PhD on Arabic theatre, which actually was at the University of Edinburgh, but I spent a lot of time between the two, between Edinburgh and Cairo, and that was in adaptations of Oedipus, Sophocles' play, in sort of contemporary, in 20th century,
Wow.
really, Egyptian theatre. So it sort of turned into a kind of history of modern Egyptian theatre, crossed with, through the lens of this particular play. But when I was doing all of that, I found all of these incredible stories in the Arabic press at the time, the entertainment press, and also memoirs by actresses and singers, and just lots of little nuggets, plus longer narratives, which I couldn't really sort of fit into the work of my PhD, but sort of found myself probably drawn to more than the work of my PhD. I sort of found it more interesting and trying to recapture these stories. I think perhaps, in combination with living in downtown Cairo at the time, and therefore sort of being in the area where it all happened. And then I just sort of tried to figure out how you might put all of these different stories together into one bigger narrative. And that's how this book sort of came about. And in the end, I think the decision I made was to view this. So, I mean, what we're calling the golden age was the 20s and 30s, I suppose. That's of cabaret and theatre, sort of live nightlife entertainment. To view that sort of period through the lives and kind of stories of the most prominent women within it.
You know what I found very interesting to start with? It's that a man took interest in the lives of these women. So as you will see throughout the webinar, one of the things that I like about your approach is this focus on how important these women that you chose, there were many more. By the way, guys, for whoever didn't read the book yet, what Raphael did was he did a selection of great female figures of the golden era and told their stories intertwined with the historic period, what was happening at the time, and also the feminist movement and the way these women, according to your perspective, and I agree with that, had a very important role in the women's rights evolution, in the way women were active in society, in the way women built themselves in ways that nowadays in Egypt you don't see anymore. So a lot of the things that you describe in this book were actually, they went backwards. They don't happen anymore in terms of rights, in terms of the way women were presenting themselves, and even in legal rights. So it's very interesting why a man would focus on the subject of feminism. For me, it's interesting for me. Is that something you were always interested in?
Well, I'm going to answer your question in a couple of ways, and also just sort of this might be a point for broader discussion. That, I mean, really, although there were these exceptional women at the time, I think probably women now in Egypt have more rights than back then, and kind of this is one of the things that makes the women in this book quite so amazing. Is that they were fighting really against a system, and there's still this fight going on between, you can see a lot of the same things that happen in the book still go on now, with sort of women in the public eye, women who are performers, but the work that they did lead to a lot of things, like such as in the 50s, women getting the right to vote, official constitutional equality, all of that kind of stuff, which didn't exist in the 20s. I mean, this is a longer conversation, which maybe we can go back
we will touch that. We will touch that. I mean, there were things that reverberated and evolved and nowadays are quite different, like the right to vote. It's true, women can vote. All right, that is great. And there are other things that did not evolve or went really backwards. And I can tell you that from my own experience of living there as a dancer, as a professional dancer, as a woman. I know the laws and I know the laws that were surrounding me and my work and my contracts and the way I could present myself on stage and the way I could not present myself on stage and how the police would come for you. The morality police, it's still there for the ones who don't know it, but we will get there. We will get there. I think there are a lot of things that we saw flourishing and others that we saw went backwards, you know? So,
but to answer your question, your first question though, why as a man I'm interested in it. I mean, I'll give you sort of I'll sort of take two quotes from women in the book. The first one is from Fatima Siri, who was a singer and sort of actress, but mostly a singer, who ended up having an affair with Mohammed Shaharawi, the son of Hoda Shaharawi, a famous feminist, and they sort of had this marriage together, unofficial marriage, urfi, and they had a child, which in the end he didn't recognize until she went to court and forced him to sort of recognize the child and give it its rights and therefore kind of money as a member of the Shahrawi family. That whole story I tell in the book, it's more complicated.
It enraged me, by the way. Guys, for the one, that was one of the topics I wanted to touch. We will get there because I will read a little bit of it. It has to do with Hoda Shaharawi, which was like the major figure, the big mother of Egyptian feminism, and her son. And well, we will get there. We will get there.
Anyway, she says when she's writing her memoirs, the accounts of this time, she specifically addresses male authors and says, "Men, you don't know anything about how a woman lives." I forget exactly the quote, but it's in there. Who are you to tell me what? Because she's anticipating kind of criticisms of her actions, and that's kind of something that hung over me a lot in the book, like what my role in telling these stories is, and that's something again maybe we can go back to. I've thought about it a lot, but I don't really have a sort of solid answer to it other than to say that was a concern. But, and now to take another quote from one of the women in the book, Fatima Rushdie, who started her own theater company in the late 1920s and was one of the biggest sort of theater impresarios and then went on to become a film star. She said that women, she was arguing that women should play men's roles in plays because she said that a woman can have I'm trying to remember now. I can almost exactly find the quote actually. Basically, here we go. I'll get it so I don't mangle her words. So she argued that such roles as Romeo, Hamlet, Napoleon, and Don Juan suit a woman's nature because they have a universal character. They have a certain subtlety and intelligence that only she, i.e. a woman, can succeed in capturing. So women, she argued, with their sensitivity to the world around them, just make better actors, whether or not the part be male or female. And then to quote her again, she says, men have been luckier than women in the acting profession, but women are better actors. Contending that only a woman can really get to the depths of the characters. And then to conclude, she said, to put it plainly, women can give a performance more complete and successful than any man. And so I sort of took this quote and then said, okay, well, if we're going to look at this period, let's look at it through the eyes of the women then, because it's a period that's been looked at quite a bit in the Arab world. I mean, not so much in English, and I'm not really aware of many books in English, but usually sort of the men are the main figures, and the women, while important, are kind of complement the male story. And I wanted to see what it looks like if you switch that and tell it from the other way around.
Absolutely.
The men basically end up looking very bad, but
This is one of the things that I really love in your book, is that it really feels like you gave women a voice. So although you're a man, I felt as a reader that you created space for the voices of these women to exist, to breathe.
that's what I hope to have done, at least. Yeah.
Yeah, you did it. It's wonderful. And it's very refreshing. And there are several descriptions. I'm not going to read them all because there's so much. Guys, my book I told Raphael, is destroyed because I made so many notes and so many things I wanted to read to you. I had to make a selection. But there are really amazing quotes that you got to share in the book from some of these amazing women from the golden era. Quotes that I had never read, I had never seen shared in a book, and I read everything that is connected with, Egyptian dance, Egyptian music, Egyptian.
Yeah, it was kind of, I spent a long time. I'm just sort of addicted to reading the press from that period, from the 20s, and I just spent a long time.
Okay, so I'm gonna read the first, guys. It's irresistible. Before you share your images, Raphael, would you allow me to read? It's an answer from an interview that was done with Fatma Rushdie. Fatma Rushdie was a famous actress of the time, and I'm gonna read it directly from the book, okay, guys, so that you understand what I mean by Raphael giving a voice to these women, and how ahead of their time they were, even by Western standards. As a Western woman, I read this and I say, wow, all right. Okay. So I'm going to read to you, okay? In one interview, when Fatma Rushdie had invited a reporter into her house to talk about her career, he bluntly said to her, "They say that you behave like a man." I love this. I heard this so many times, in my life. They say that you behave like a man. Though you are a woman, you may actually be tougher than a man. They say that you don't have any emotions. You don't have the feelings of a woman, feminine delicacy or gentleness. What do you think about that? She just laughed. Fatma was not afraid to answer these kinds of questions. So she answered, and I love this: "I don't have time for stupid things like this. I do absolutely everything that a woman should do. My mind is constantly working. My body is heavy and worn out. My ambitions are greater than my mind and stronger than my body. I don't have time to do all I need and at the same time flaunt my femininity. What do you want from me? What do they even mean by femininity? How do they want a woman to live?" I love that.
That's great, isn't it? I love Fatma Rushdie. She's incredible.
This was like on point, and we could spend the entire webinar just focusing on this quote because there is so much juice here. I just wanted our participants to see and to feel what I mean by ahead of our time. And this idea that performers, dancers, singers, actresses of that time, but also nowadays, they're considered not feminine or masculine just because they take a stand and they take charge of their life and they don't have time to lose with bullshit, basically. I love it.
And I mean, two things I would say about that quote. Like you say, we could say a million things.
Yeah.
Was one. So Fatma Rushdie talks about this thing a lot, but as does Munir al-Mahdeya, who is also like a big part of the book. She started off as a singer, then moved to become an actress and also kind of a dancer because she danced on stage and had dance numbers. She was famous for when she first started her acting career, like Fatma Rushdie, for taking male roles. But then in the 1920s, she goes sort of even further and really dresses up as a man a lot, and has photos sent in. So I can probably actually find some, but maybe that'll be for not directly now because I don't want to interrupt the thought. And I think she's kind of, I mean, one of the things she's doing, among other things, is playing with this idea that you talked about, that everyone says, you know, women in the public sphere and kind of performers, especially in the 20s, there's a big idea that they're becoming men or they're becoming manly by being, you know, so assertive or in the public sphere or whatever you want to say. So by dressing up as a man and sending the and sort of sending the pictures into the press.
And as simple as being able to work. Many of these women managed their own career. So they took charge of their own career. They were not depending on a man to support them. Very often they supported the men who were with them. They went out of their homes to work, and they were exposing themselves physically, emotionally to the public eye, which is, as anyone who knows Egypt, a big no-no, because we're talking about an Islamic country, or predominantly Islamic country, where the body of a woman should not be exposed. It is like almost like a subtle law. And if you break it, you are automatically out of the role of the feminine good woman. You know, you're out of it. You're not, you're put into a different shelf that nobody knows exactly how to characterize.
And another thing I would say about that quote from Fatma Rushdie was, and there's kind of a debate, or at least there's a debate in my mind over how far, you know, you should call these women feminists. I mean, I think you should. But, you know, there's an argument on the other side saying that, oh, really, they were mostly concerned with their own careers and not necessarily about bringing up, you know, other women with them. I mean, that would be the argument against, which I sort of don't agree with. But one of, I think, the main, or at least one of the important reasons why you can call women like Fatma Rushdie feminists, or, you know, part of the feminist movement, is that they were publicly saying things like that and, you know, other things, which were extremely radical.
You know, even if they did not assume the feminist cause, they were being feminists without noticing. You know, like just the fact that you are not gonna follow what the society is telling you it's your role as a woman, just because you're going against the grind and putting yourself out there in a completely different way. Even nowadays, guys in Egypt, even nowadays, a woman, and I'm talking generally, okay? A woman is supposed to get married and have children. Even nowadays, actresses and singers and dancers are not seen as respectful women. And we're talking about 2021. And now we're talking about the golden era, the 1920s, the 1930s, before. So of course they were, I mean, even if they were fetching for themselves, which they were, obviously, and very ambitiously, very ambitious, they were building the feminist cause without knowing it. What do you think? I mean,
yeah, and sometimes with knowing it too. But yeah, but these living these public lives like this and saying publicly things like what Fatma Rushdie said, but also there's many other examples in the book of people talking about, you know, for instance, not wanting to get married. Badia Masabni, who I'm sure we're going to come back and talk about later, there's a quote of her, you know, saying that really to be an artist, you need to be single, because to be single is to be free. And that's what. And
the way they talked about men is quite shocking.
Yeah.
Oh my God, that is quite shocking. I was like, what? Wow, it's almost violent. The way they talked about men and marriage and partnerships, they were not interested. Move it out of the way so that I can do my thing. Okay. Let's dive deep. Before that, I think it's time for you to share your images. Okay. Would that be okay for you?
So this is just, it's just going to be short. But what I thought I'd do is, because this is primarily, I think, an audience, if not exclusively an audience of people interested in dance. And my book, here it is, as I said before, sort of deals with theater and song and dance and everything all together. I thought I'd just say a little bit specifically about the dance halls from the late 19th century until then ending up with the mid 20th century. Partly as well just to know if anyone else has to show you some pictures which I couldn't put in the book and which I think you might find interesting.
Yes.
But also just wondering if anyone has any other kind of comments. So this is a map actually from the book. And what I'm going to start with, so basically my interpretation, at least, of what happens in Ezbekaya, which is, this is the Nightlife District here around the Ezbekaya Gardens, is that, so Ahmed el-Din Street, you'll see on the left, is the most famous street in the 1920s, and that's really where everything, or like the center, at least, of everything in the 1920s. But there's also this period in the 19th century, which is a little less known about, but still extremely interesting, which mostly took place sort of to the east, the right of Ezbekaya Gardens, and perhaps was more connected to older traditions of dance that had existed in Egypt for longer. And the most famous dance hall was this old El Dorado music hall, and we have a couple of pictures of it there. I mean, postcards from it from the late 19th century are quite famous, and I think people may have seen these ones. There were also several other music halls like this. The Elf Leila wa Leila started in the late 19th century. Nusrat el Nufus, that's Munira Mahdeya's. Takht el Banet, Alcazar Parisian, the new El Dorado Theatre, Elias, etc. There's a whole bunch of these dance halls which were popular in the late 19th century, sort of to the east of Ezbekaya Gardens, which came before the sort of golden age. And it's quite hard sometimes to know exactly what a night at them looked like. I think the best kind of, well, the most detailed description that we have, which I quote a little bit in the book, comes from Hadith's Isa ibn Hisham, or what Isa ibn Hisham said, or however you want to call it, in which he describes a sort of dancer and singer at one of these nightclubs, in which people are sort of drinking and smoking, and she's on stage. But the description is extremely negative. So he's sort of, it's really more.
Guys, so Raphael, let me interrupt you. What Raphael is giving us is the transitional period just before what we call the golden age, right? So we're talking about the Hawazid, the Awalem, and a world that slowly melted into the golden era. All right, so it's like the before.
Yeah, and
right?
these kind of music halls like this were, again, sort of part, I suppose, of the transition, because previously dancing would have been on the streets probably, or in private houses, not in specific dance halls. But and so you've got these dance halls. You have also there's a fantastic map actually, which you can look at on Harvard's website. I've given an address. It's from 1905. It's called the Goad Insurance Map. But I printed it off here because if you see Harat El Rouai, just above number 79, you can see actually the location of the original El Dorado concert hall, which actually you can sort of, when I was in Cairo, I went to have a look at what's there. And it's sort of nothing. I mean, it's sort of, it's that area now mostly sells sort of fridges and sort of household appliances. And so I did go, and there's sort of a little bit of a back room where you could sort of maybe use your imagination and think that it's still there, but basically it's sort of a shell. But I highly recommend this map because it's a lot of fun for just sort of wandering around, mentally wandering around what it was like in 1905. I got for you some pictures of some of the most famous dancers, which are all from this book, Kitab Mufri al-Jins al-Latif, by this guy called Bulaki. But you have here Sithen al-Yahudiyya al-Iskandaraniya, so she's just known as sort of the Jewish Alexandrian woman. Is barely even given a name. Next to her is the very famous Shafiq al-Ibtiya, Shafika the Copt, about whom a film was made in the 60s. But this is a picture of her from the late 19th century. And then two others, Sit Zakaya Rushdom and Sit Badi al-Masreya. So, yeah, in this late 19th century period, it's much harder to find information about. But I thought you'd be interested to see a few pictures of some of the dancers from that period.
Absolutely.
what the dancers look like. Here is the very famous Tauhida, who again kind of was still popular actually in the 1920s, but her career had started much earlier. She ran the Elf Layla wa Layla music hall, which I had 1001 Nights music hall, which is on the map here. And her story is another fascinating one. Not that much information, but she was married to a Greek man, Ioannidis, who ran the music hall, it seems, where they sort of maybe ran it together. But after he died, she took it over and became its main proprietress. Big famous, and kept going into the 1920s. And at the very end of the 1920s, she goes to Ahmed al-Din Street for a little while, but doesn't really kick off. And then after then, so we come to Badia Masabni, Tahir Karaoke, and Samia Gamel obviously come from her. I wonder if maybe this would be a chance to talk about her more. I just thought I'd show these pictures because these are the ones that I found most difficult to find and I found the most interesting of this kind of 19th century period, just before the golden age. And I wondered if anyone wanted to talk
in the
about
book. That one is in the book, right?
This one is in the book, yeah. And also this one is actually, well, that's the original of this is in the book. This is actually as it appears in a newspaper. I just thought I'd give you a little bit of value added because this kind of stuff isn't in the book, but thought as dancers.
It is beautiful. Now, let us go a little bit chronologically, all right? So we're not going to touch in all the women that you approached in the book because we would be here till tomorrow. As I told you, I made so many notes, it's going to be impossible to share everything. So I selected the ones that I consider the most important for dancers, for Oriental dancers. So the first one is Shafiq al-Qubtiyya. This is the first one because she's associated with the dance of the candelabrum. She's associated with this transition between the world of the Awalem, the world of the Hawazi, and the more professionalized world of the salas, the cabarets, the nightclubs, the theaters, which is one of the characteristics of the golden era, is this professionalization that happens during this time on many levels. So what would be interesting, in your opinion, to tell dancers about Shafiq al-Qubtiyya? What would you like to share about her? I know there's a lot, but...
Yeah, I mean, she's interesting because I think she is the first really, the first dancing celebrity, female celebrity dancer that you can really identify in Egypt. I mean, there had been like Almaz, who had been a singer, but Shafiq al-Qubtiyya is really the first big female dancer celebrity in Egypt. And in many ways, her kind of life functions as a sort of blueprint for people who come after her, at least, the way it's told, that she is very, partly because it's told as well in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, but that she sort of runs away from her family to join the world of dance. It's said that she trained with this woman, Shulp. I guess we're not sure. But then she ends up running her own cabaret. And really what I found interesting about her is you can go to secret police files, which exist from the period. Am I still? From the period there in Durham, actually. And there's this one police officer who goes around as Ezbekaya in the 1890s and looks into what's going on, really, all the drunkenness and fights and things. But he identifies Shafiq al-Qubtiyya as running her own nightclub. And you can see the kind of business techniques that she's using, which sort of, again, offer a blueprint for independent women sort of running their businesses. And some of them are a little bit underhand. So one thing she does is develops relationships with the local police. In one case, with the local British sort of deputy head of police, she's said to have a romantic relationship with him, and hangs out in the police office the whole time, and is
very convenient. Very convenient. Even today, you need good relationships with the police.
and another thing she does is has a relationship, whether it's romantic or not, it's not said, with another police officer, and convinces him to arrest people from rival nightclubs, or like shut down rival nightclubs.
Oh my God. Yeah, I would imagine. I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised. Absolutely. You know, something that I noticed, I already knew that, but you make it very clear in your book. Most of these singers and dancers, they have a similar beginning and a similar ending.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so you see this story of the girl running away from the family or running from the village, or, you know, arriving to the big city of Cairo. You can only imagine how it must have felt for these young women to arrive to Cairo, some of them from the countryside, and find that jungle and find possibilities, but find also traps and dangers and insecurity, and having to fetch for themselves. And then the way they finish their life is quite tragic. I was just getting here to Shafiqa's death.
Mm-hmm.
He died in a tiny room in Darb el Bar'i, one of the winding alleys of Clotby Street, poor and miserable. None of those who enjoyed her dancing and knew the beguiling secret of her art attended her funeral. That's sad. And
it's, yeah, like you said, it's very common. The same thing is said about Munira al-Mahdaya. I mean, there's actually photos of her funeral, and it's kind of only 5 or 6 people. The same thing almost happens to Fatima Rushdie, who is found, you know, destitute on the street until actually someone sort of discovers that this is what's happened to her and gives her some money and revives her. And yeah, it's a very common pattern, and it's a difficult one because I didn't want to. In some ways, it's a narrative trap, that way of telling the life of these women, but you know, one that's hard to escape. But to me, there's a kind of undertone to it that's a bit misogynistic, i.e., you can be as rebellious as you want, the subtext goes, but in the end, you know, you're gonna die alone and sad. And it's hard to, you know, it's sort of, and how do you avoid that? Because in the case of Shafiqa, it seems that is how she died, as with sort of Munira al-Mahdaya as well, and almost with Fatima Rushdie. So it's kind of, you can't sort of change that. But for other women, you could tell the story differently. I mean, Kulthum obviously is an exceptional case. She ends up with an enormous, you know, 1 million person funeral, partly because she managed to become this, you know, kind of symbol of national womanhood, a sort of palatable symbol of national womanhood. So she's an exceptional case in that way too. But, you know, other women, Rosal Youssef died pretty happily alone in bed. Fatima Siri, hard to say, but you know, not tragic death. So I didn't want to be caught by that narrative, but equally, it is one that is told the whole time. So I also didn't want to ignore it.
You know, Kulthum was exceptional in many ways. In many ways, she was also very savvy and very strategic, and very disciplined. So as I read about the lives of these singers and dancers of the golden era, I have the idea that they were having so much fun, and they did really so much fun, and they were making lots of money. But you get the feeling, at least I do get the feeling, they were not really disciplined and saving and working for the future. Kulthum was a very different character, and it was not surprising that she managed her career the way she did, and she remains until today, as you know, like the biggest symbol of Egyptian music. You know, till today it's an icon, absolutely unbeatable. She's unique.
Yeah, and it's amazing. Every step of her career, she managed, you know, to manage it so well. She's so in control of it from almost the moment she comes to Cairo, really, in the 1920s.
A strategist. Kulthum was a strategist. She was not only a great talent, she was very intelligent. She knew how to present herself. So if these women that we're speaking about in the early golden era period were women who didn't care about the way others perceive them, Kulthum cared about the way others perceive them, and she was very careful in building an image with equal amounts of respectability and sensual appeal. It's just,
I mean, she is. It's incredible to see, and I didn't think necessarily that I'd be, before writing the book, I didn't think I'd be quite as impressed with her as I was. Just every moment she makes the right move.
Absolutely, and also extremely ambitious and very wild and merciless with competition. as all of them were, which brings me to the rivalry between Munira, El Mahdeya, and Kulthum. So this interests me a lot because they represent, as you wrote in the book, very different styles of women, very different styles of singers, and also different periods of the golden era. Can you tell us a little bit more about Munira and how she became, the main competitor, or the opposite? How Kulthum became the main competitor for her?
So Shafia Liptia is sort of the first big female celebrity dancer. Of that transition period. Munira El Mahdeya, it's interesting because she really straddles the transition period and then goes into the 1920s golden age. So she starts singing in Cairo, most people say, in 1905. I mean, we can definitely say that by 1912-13, she's a big, successful recording artist. So she's there at this time before the First World War, when what's running the show are these kind of dance halls like the ones we saw, the Ancien El Dorado and all of these things, before the sort of cabarets of the 1920s. So she starts in that milieu as a singer, almost exclusively as a singer, and becomes an extremely successful one. Again, a little bit hard. It's said that she ran her own nightclub. I didn't specifically find evidence of that being, contemporary evidence of that. But it seems certainly possible. She was also tied up with this man called Mahmoud Gabrbe, who was her husband and financial manager in the kind of 1910s. So she becomes very successful. During the war, she then moves to become an actress too, as well as a singer. And then she kind of bursts on as the biggest game in town at the beginning of the 1920s. She divorces her husband in 1924 after an extremely long battle. And one of the things that actually her divorce shows is just how important financial independence is to someone like her, because she is forced to actually pay him money in order to get the divorce. But she does it. And then, so that's in 1924. So she's kind of, at that moment, at the top of her game, probably the biggest singer in Cairo at the time, who also is an actress, a sort of musical theater actress. And that's the time when Kulthum is really first coming up. She comes to Cairo early 1920s and makes a storm. People very quickly see her as a new up-and-coming star, a rival to Munira, from 1924. Maybe not, for at least from 1925, it's clear that they're going to rival each other. And that is as well the same time when... So one of the things I think is important about the Golden Age is that people don't necessarily talk about that much, is that the entertainment magazines are also going through this Golden Age. So we have, as well as the nightclub stages.
Rosal Youssef.
Exactly. And Rosal Youssef and millions of others too. Everyone's starting them. So at the same time as we have all these new cabarets and music halls, we have this sort of creation of celebrity being played out in the magazines. There's photographs of the singers. They run all these really sort of sometimes quite prurient, sometimes just kind of curious stories about actresses, particularly focused on women. So they'll run a story being, how does Munira Mahdeya live? What's her house like? There'll be pictures of that. They run stories kind of like, oh, what do actresses eat for breakfast? How do they answer the telephone? All of this kind of stuff, in combination with sort of more the sort of stuff you would expect, focused on their appearance. You know, who's the most pretty actress? Who's the ugly actress? There was one article I saw, which is how much all the actresses weigh, and then it gave all of their weights.
Oh my God! Really? That's funny.
So this is also going on at the same time when
The culture
Munira,
of celebrity, the culture of celebrity that didn't exist before. It is born at this time.
Exactly, and it happens as Munira and Kulthum, their rivalry is going on, and it's of course like stoked. Their rivalry is stoked by the press. But what's interesting about those two is the completely different approaches that they take to the entertainment press and to their celebrity. So Kulthum is extremely reserved, doesn't really like to give interviews, and if she doesn't really say very much. And there's a bit later when she does start giving interviews in the sort of early 1930s. She writes about her. She gets up early in the morning, reads a book, goes for a walk in the garden among the flowers, that kind of thing. Whereas Munira Mahteh is the total opposite, and she just stokes all of these kind of salacious rumors about her. Famously, she buys this extremely expensive houseboat on the Nile, 2 stories, where she holds.
What I find amazing about Kulthum is that one of the things, many other things, she understood that in order to remain enduring, in order to remain an icon, to become and to remain, she had to be Egypt's sweetheart somehow. And she found a very efficient way of doing it, because all these amazing women from the golden era, they were not the sweethearts. They were the vamps. They were the bad girls. They were not the sweetheart, the sweetie, the good girl. They were all the opposite. So if you know a little bit about Egyptian mentality and culture, you will surely know they would not remain in the psyche of Egyptians as their icons, their forever icons. Kulthum found that sweet spot between pushing boundaries and appealing to the listener's senses. And then again, if we go into the lyrics, the Arabic, what she's singing about, it's very sensual. Sometimes I discuss this with musicians, and even with my musicians when I was working in Cairo. Now, when I learned Arabic and I understood what she was saying, I say, what? Is she saying what I think she's saying? Because it's very sensual, but at the same time, building this persona of respectability, of a Muslim regarded woman who was very respectful, very careful with her image, like a mother. Kulthum, yani fahlan, really like the mother of Egypt, almost a maternal figure that Egyptians could respect, not only feel interested in, but respect, like a mother.
It's interesting that she too kind of comes up against, she's not immune from criticism. So that's a story I talk about a little bit in the book. And I think I might give the reference to it, so she's invited to play in the American University in Ewart Hall. And it's broadcast on the radio, but then there's some protest about it because people think there shouldn't be a female singer from the American University. People think this is not appropriate. And so the American University commissions a lot of people to ask for their opinion, basically, on whether Kulthum is respectable or not. And so there's an article by Heather Sharkey, which I cite in the book, which goes through that a bit, but also those files are actually available online. They're digitized by the AUC, so you can go through them. That in her, people are discussing whether or not she's appropriate. There's this big, long file with lots of different answers. Some people say, yes, it's fine. Some people said what you just said, which is basically the lyrics. If you really listen to them, you can tell that they're...
If you know Arabic and you understand what she's saying, it's impossible. And you know the culture and the mentality and the religion, it's impossible not to wonder, what? It's impossible. because it is, yes, it is poetic. Arabic language is very poetic, very romantic, but there's more than poeticism. There is a lot of sensuality, not only in the lyrics, but also in the way she sings them. Also in the way she sings them. So she was coming from this Quranic training. There is this very interesting mix between almost religious recitation and sensuality in the way she sings that makes it irresistible, but very complex and very appealing, especially to Egyptians, of course. Now, I'm going to read a bit from the book. Guys, look at this photo from Kulthum. That's Habibti. Okay, so I'm going to read a little bit from the differences between Munira al-Mahdaya and her rival, her new rival, Kulthum. In 1925, a young critic called Abdel Majd Hilmi, in a theater review, made a much blunter comparison between the two women. Kulthum, he thought, represented everything that entertainment should be. Go to see her, he said, and you would hear an angelic voice that rises from a sensitive heart, which has a feeling for life, and a heavenly tune which will send your soul the joy of hope and the strength of youth. The tone of pure gold rings out in the air, in harmony with the art of nature. Then he turned to Munir al-Mahdaya, whose musical theater was still thriving in Cairo, and the comparison was unfavorable. Munira, he said, has turned the theater into a dance hall. The crowd cheer for the tune, shake it, and she just laughs back at them. So, gentlemen, what is now the difference between your refined theater and the cafés chantants in the dirty native areas? He had to ask. Isn't what Munira is doing corrupting our morals and spreading vice?
And I mean, interestingly as well, he then, so it's always said, went on to have an affair with Munira. So
that's priceless. Yeah. That's priceless. I love that. Yeah, welcome to Contradictions, which takes me to another point in the book that I absolutely loved and was feeling shocked by, and I didn't know about, which is the story about Shaharawi, her son. Can you tell us about that? You have an entire chapter dedicated to that, and I find it so interesting. Such a contradiction. And guys, you will understand why. Can you tell us about this story?
Yeah, I mean, and there's so much is going on in the story. I trailed it sort of very briefly at the beginning. But so Fatima Siri, who is a singer, goes to give a performance actually at Hoda Shaharawi's house. Hoda Shaharawi, who is the most famous feminist in Egypt at the time, sort of the most prominent, runs the Egyptian Feminist Union, all of this. She has a lot of musical nights at her villa, it's sort of thing that she does. She invites Fatima Siri to one of these nights where Mohammed Shaharawi, her son, catches her eye, at least. So really the only thing we know about this story comes from Fatima Siri's own account. So that's sort of what I'm telling it from. Mohammed Shaharawi sees her, starts to go to the theaters and concert halls where she's performing and kind of propose an affair with her, essentially. Invites her out to drive with him. At first, she keeps sort of pushing him back. In her account, she says, "Oh, she knows basically what this kind of thing goes on the whole time, and she knows it always ends badly." But eventually, he's persistent. They get together. They fall in love. They have an Orfi marriage. An Orfi marriage basically being, for those who don't know, a sort of unofficial marriage, although signed and drawn up, supposedly kind of official, but sort of semi. Anyway, so they have this. They get together. She gets pregnant. They move into a kind of flat, or at least he moves her into a flat in downtown Cairo and goes to visit her. She stops her singing career and thinks, okay, great, we're gonna live together. This is the rest of my life. And she's sort of, according to her account, she's come to terms with that. I mean, and this is the thing that happens to a lot of singers at the time, that they get into relationships with men who then say, okay, you can stop singing now, we're married, it's done. And probably if you're Fatima Siri, you think, okay, well, that's good. I found a nice, good man. He's got money. And a singing career might not have been the most appealing thing. I mean, there's, as I talk about in the book, there's a lot of difficulty in a singing career in the 1920s in Cairo and a lot of danger. So anyway, they're settled down. But then it all takes a turn for the worse. They end up arguing. There's a long sort of series of events. She has a child. He abandons her, and then kind of says the child isn't his. But what she does, which is, presumably that kind of thing had happened a lot. What she does, which makes it different, and which is why we now know the story, is that she takes him to court and sues him for child support, or to recognize the child. And it's an enormous sort of 6 or 7 year court case, which there's all these different kind of verdicts. But eventually she wins. And, importantly, I think for what we've been talking about, the fact that she can support herself and pay for this court case through her singing is one of the reasons why she's able to do it, which is also, again, one of the reasons why we know the story and why the story even happened at all. So there's that aspect to it. Another aspect to it, which makes it all the more interesting as a story, is that she, throughout her account, says that she expects Hoda Shaharawi to help her out because she's a woman in need. And she sort of appeals to Hoda Shaharawi. But Fatma Siri says that her messages are kind of rebuffed. And she at one point, Hoda Shaharawi sends a secretary to try and pay her off, which she refuses. And there's also kind of Fatma Siri thinks that Hoda Shaharawi is sort of not really pro this relationship anyway, and is even perhaps encouraging Mohammed, her son, to leave her because she's an actress, therefore not a respectable match for the son of Hoda Shaharawi. So there's all kind of things going on. One, a woman who is now, who through being a singer is able to take a case like this to court and win, which is sort of unprecedented before then.
Absolutely.
But then also this kind of tension between mainstream Egyptian feminism and this other world of singers and dancers who stand kind of in parallel to that.
I found it amazing because when you think about Hoda Shaharawi, and we have at the school a course about the golden era, and I offer them a history class, introduction to the golden era. And I told them about Hoda Shaharawi. It's impossible for me to talk about the golden era without mentioning her. But what shocked me and what I find so interesting is that contradictions can coexist inside a person. So we're talking about a high society lady, of course. Hoda Shaharawi didn't come from nothing. She came from money. So she was educated, she had money, but she was also, in terms of mentality, she was the head of the feminist movement in Egypt. She was ahead of her time on so many levels, but not in relation to the prejudice that was thrown upon actresses and dancers and singers at that time and still today. So she tried to buy her off. She tried to stop the marriage from succeeding. For me, the combination between the prejudice and how amazing and intelligent and advanced she was is mind-blowing. How these two things could coexist in one woman.
Yeah, I mean, it's like you say, it's the complexities are part of what makes this kind of history so interesting.
I was totally mind blown, and to tell you the truth, very shocked, a little disappointed because I didn't know this. I didn't know this story before I read the book.
There's also in Arabic, the theater scholar who died recently, Nihad Saleha, wrote a book in which there's a big chapter also devoted to it, and she tried to sort of figure out what had happened to Fatma Siri after all of this, and had not really been that, had not managed to really track it down. She sort of come up against a lot of dead ends. And I think there's a story to be told about what happens to her afterwards, which I'm sort of trying to look into a bit now, because I think that would
But it
that would
is
be interesting
amazing.
reading.
And there is a detail in that story that caught my attention too, which is, I don't know the intricacies, but you mentioned that they married through the Orphi system. Orphi, for the ones who don't know, that still exists in Egypt. It's like a quick marriage. Some say Orphi is the kind of marriage you do when you want to be with someone and you don't want problems with the police. So it's not really like a real marriage. And how she could pull that off, how she could take him to court, even with an Orphi marriage, which is not totally 100% legitimized, and win the
Yeah.
case for her and for her daughter.
I mean, amazing. It took a long time then.
Extraordinary. It's really extraordinary. If you told me this story happened nowadays, I would still be surprised. But this is, way back. It's amazing, and it got me curious. How much more information was there? How did she manage it? There must be, so much more about that story, because it is not easy. And obviously, we were talking about the wealthy man coming from a wealthy, influential family as well. So it's like, what? How did she manage it? It's really amazing. And it's a big step in terms of women's rights and, evolution and everything that is possible in terms of respect for women. It's really amazing. Now, I would like to ask you about two main women, of course. Badia Masabni, absolutely. This is absolutely impossible to escape. And then a little bit more about Kulthum, if you can. So
I'd like to. I can talk a bit about Badia Masabni, but I'd also like to ask you about her a little bit, because I go into her life story quite a lot in the book, which I can say briefly now. Which is incredible, and in large part described in her memoirs, but also in a few other places. She's born in Damascus. Like almost every woman in the book, her father dies when she's young, and that might be something we could talk about. Why exactly? I think it's probably a combination of, if your father dies when you're very young, you need to make money somehow, and getting into the entertainment business maybe is a good way to do that, combined with perhaps that there's no longer a father figure in the family to stop you going into the entertainment business. I mean, I think it might be both of those combined.
It might be a combination of many things.
Yeah.
As well what you shared, but also the fact that the figure of the father and the figure of the man in a woman's life, it's so central, it's so crucial. And what I find, and what I'm about to say is very polemic, but it's true. What I find is that many artists, dancers, actresses, singers, they try to fill the void of that paternal figure very often through creativity, through their career, through the search for their identity, because there is a part of their identity, which is the father, who was not there from an early age. But this is just my observation, What else could you tell us?
So anyway, so she grows up in Damascus, but when her father dies, the family kind of falls apart. One of her brothers becomes an alcoholic, and it all becomes very tragic. And she is probably raped by the owner of the bar, who run the bar that her brother goes to, although she doesn't specifically say. She's at least sexually assaulted in sort of some way. She's very coy about it. But then, so that happens, and then she's kind of ostracized from what seems to be a reasonably conservative Christian neighborhood that she lives in, where she grows up. So the family basically has to leave Damascus, ends up going to Beirut, Buenos Aires for a little bit, back to Lebanon. She turns up in Cairo, and then the way she describes it, she sort of sees a play. She sees George Abiad's troupe giving a play, sees this woman on stage dressed in an amazing dress, and thinks, I want to be, this is what I want to do with my life. And she then goes on stage, loves it. It sort of seems to sort of work through a lot of her difficult childhood by being an actress. And her life is totally then, for the next few years, bounces around everywhere. She falls in love with Munira Mahdea's music. She then moves to Beirut during the First World War, where she performs in a cabaret there, doing a lot of Munira's songs, and she's there traveling around all of kind of Hashem, the Levant, throughout the late 1910s, the early 1920s, until she runs into Naguibah Rahani's troupe, who then take her back to Egypt. She then marries Naguibah Rahani, and they stay together for sort of a year, and it's not very successful. And they separate, although don't officially divorce. There's a whole story with that too. Everything in Badia's life is a long story. Then, so she leaves his troupe and takes the money that she has and sets up her sala on Ahmed Dean Street in 1926, which becomes this kind of revolutionary new venue. I mean, a lot has been said about it. In my view, what she kind of manages to do is fuse the older traditions of the music hall from the 19th century that we've sort of already looked at a little bit with Shafia Liptia and so on, with a kind of more European style of cabaret, of the kind that actually existed in Cairo and the Kosal and so on. And what she manages to do is put those two together, package it in this new way, largely for an Egyptian audience rather than a European one, and it takes off with various kind of. She also does like lots of other things, like has female matinees, again, which are things which had existed in the theatre before, but had not existed for the 19th century music hall style of entertainment, and is in financial and creative control, it seems, of what she has, and it just takes off. Through the 20s and 30s, she is the huge star of Egyptian cabaret. And the thing actually I wanted to ask you about, whether you had any views. I mean, I'd be interested to hear what you think about any of it, but in particular, she's always said to have been extremely innovative as a dancer. Mm-hmm. But my specialty not particularly being in dance, I'm not really able to explain exactly why, and I'd be curious to know.
Sure. Okay, so there are a couple of things that I find important in Badia Masabni's persona. I was searching for the word persona. One is her past, as you described, was very irregular in the way that she lived, in the countries that she lived. She knew Spanish. She wrote and spoke Spanish very well. She was, until very late in life, a very, very well-rounded, well-spoken, smart, savvy, intelligent woman who was a woman of the world. You could feel she was a woman of the world. So my feeling from her story is that when she arrives to Cairo, she already has a mind that is bigger than Cairo. She was not a country girl, like Kulthum. She was coming already with a lot of references from Argentina, from Lebanon, from the places where she was raised, from the places where she was jumping with her family. So this is one thing, is that her mind was cosmopolitan.
Yeah, and there definitely also seems to be a sort of Spanish influence in the artists that she brings into her cabaret.
Yes, absolutely. Also, her character. I don't know if you ever watched, I shared with our students in the Golden Era course, there is an interview of Badia Masabni. She even dances and plays the sagat a little bit. And she's so great. And you can clearly feel that she was the kind of woman who would find a solution, a creative solution for everything. She might not have been the brightest singer or dancer or choreographer, but she was very smart, and she could touch in these different arts with the fluidity and the vision of the future that nobody else at the time had, from what I know. Now, in terms of dance innovation, what she did was she brought, first of all, the choreographic demands to the stage. She brought the Western influences to the dance. So what people nowadays call belly dance, the modern Egyptian dance, raqs al-sharqi, is a product of her work, is a product of all the influences she introduced in the dance, including classic ballet, Spanish dance, flamenco, all these references that she had gathered. And of course, she went, as you know, abroad for travels, for work, and also to scout people on several occasions. So she was very keen and very focused on mixing the Oriental Raqs al-Baladi with Western influences and putting it putting it in a language and in a way that would appeal to Egyptians and to foreigners in a very professional, theatrical way. So she totally changed the game for Oriental dancers. Totally.
Do you also know about Isaac Dixon at all? I have not been able to, so he's a figure.
You mentioned him in the book. I had never heard about him. And I've read so much about Badi'a Masabni, and I heard about her from my musicians in Cairo, and nobody has ever told me about this man.
No, he's so hard to find. So for the purposes of people who don't know, and I don't know that much about him, but from the 1930s, probably not before, he works with Badi'a Masabni as a choreographer. And Tahir Carioca mentions him. I think Samia Gamel mentions him, but I'm not sure about that. He's mentioned, comes out quite a lot as the person who was the choreographer for Badi'a Masabni, who then later goes on to work as a choreographer in several films and actually briefly as an actor.
I honestly had never heard about him.
But I don't know anything. And in 1956, he sort of totally disappears, which makes one assume maybe he was British.
It is possible. She had this vision of modernity, just like Abdul Wahab after her. No, this vision of let's make it Egyptian. Also because there is a panorama, an historic panorama going in the background, guys. We're talking about the transition between the British domination and what was known as the nationalist time period or era in Egypt, where suddenly you had this transitional figure of King Farouk, which was a puppet of the British, basically. He was not there for Egyptians. He was there for himself. And then you have Abdul Nasser and all this movement of Egyptians assuming their identity and wanting to know, who are we? What is our culture? What is our music? What is our dance? What is our language? Who are we as a country, as a culture? Who are we? After so many centuries of colonialism, of English, of French, of Turkish occupation. So it is great that Badi'a Masabni, just like Abdul Wahab, they had this in common, They were people who loved the Egyptian culture and identity, but they were also able to bring Western influences and to create languages that felt very Egyptian, but still modern.
I mean, I would say, I agree with what you said about NASA, but I would say that also that is really going on in the 20s and 30s as well, those same questions. I mean, but politically, Egypt is officially independent, although, of course, the British are there.
Not really.
Behind the scenes. But people are starting to ask those questions a lot in the 20s and 30s too, about what it means to make Egyptian dance theater song. And then they just sort of get turned into overdrive in the 50s and 60s. But they build a lot on what's going on in this period too.
Which brings me to a question from Tatania. She says, how much do you think British influence had on the emergence of dance halls and the women taking independence? How much do you think British influence had on the emergence of dance halls and the women taking independence?
I mean, one answer I have to that is very kind of pragmatic in a certain way. So the golden age of the 20s and 30s comes after the First World War and the 1919 revolution and all of this political upset. One thing I would say was that in the First World War, the entertainment scene really changes a lot, partly because of the British, in a strange sort of roundabout way, because in 1915, they closed down all the dance halls, or almost all of them at least, because British soldiers, or at least soldiers from the British Empire, including various other nations, have come to Cairo, although there's no fighting in Egypt, really. If soldiers in Gallipoli end up in Cairo and go to Ezbekaya, cause a lot of trouble. The British get worried, and so they close down the dance halls. Therefore, the people who are working in the dance halls need to move. I mean, what I see happening, although no one specifically says it, is that they move into the theater, and therefore the fact that the creation of the Franco-Arab Review, Kish Kish Bey, Naguib Rahani, all of these sort of musical review theaters comes just after all the dance halls have been closed down by the British, I think is not coincidental. I think it's a way for these performers to find audiences, except this time by going into the theater. And then this whole new style of theater is constructed around these sort of necessities, partly because of the British, because of what they did. But then in 1919, when Egypt rises up in revolution against British control, these theaters really take on a new life, a new kind of national significance. And that's part of, I think, what feeds into what makes this period, among many, many other things, like what makes this period so exciting is this new sense of possibility, of new potential nationhood, which is eventually sort of thwarted by the British, but there's a sense that there's something there as well, and as well as the feminist movement, which also adds to this, more to this sense of possibility and sort of snowballs into something big. So I think, I don't think we should credit the British with creating the 1920s entertainment scene, but I think we can see a chain of events in which they were involved.
Mm-hmm. Now, let's dive into Kulthum a little bit. And Taia Carioca, because Taia Carioca is the last character you focused on in the book. And of course, you had your own criteria. I could also ask you why you chose these women, because there were more, right? I mean, why these ones? And why these ones are particularly important to illustrate this time. So one thing at a time. Kulthum first. We already spoke about her competition with Munira and how they represented different kinds of women, different kinds of performers, different kinds of women and realities. And what can you tell us in terms of the importance of Kulthum for the building of the new Egypt, of the new woman, of the new concept of what it meant to be a female performer in Egypt?
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge question, but obviously she is so important. And I mean, the thing, as we've said, kind of that makes us so interesting is just how she is at every stage of her career able to kind of move with the times. So in the when she's first coming up in the 20s, she's this kind of young, like fresh-faced, sort of incredibly talented, sort of almost girl, who then moves through the sort of the 1930s and 40s and moves into her own more, gets more control over herself, and then sort of manages, I think, to see that she is becoming a representative of Egypt in some way. Because when the revolution comes in 1952, she really throws herself behind it, and there's all these stories. 1950s and 60s is sort of a little bit after the scope of the book, but all these stories about her personal friendships with Nasser and this kind of stuff. But what she definitely does do is goes into the radio office, and there's a great scene where which I have a picture of somewhere. I keep telling you I have pictures of things and not showing you them. But in which she cleanses her records of the past of references to, the previous era, which presumably means the the king, and manages to move with the times, and then becomes in the 50s and 60s this symbol of the new sort of post-colonial Egyptian state, tied to sort of Arab nationalism and all this stuff. I mean, how exactly she does it is a
and
much longer
also
story.
very important strategic steps she took with the war with Israel. As you know, that is like a decisive moment in the history of Egypt and in the mentality of Egyptians. The war with Israel and the way Egypt lost the war and the way she performed for the troops, the way she supported politics at the time, the way she stood for Egypt and for the Islamic Republic of Egypt. It's important to say Islamic against Israel, Jewish. So there is even, she was so, as I mentioned, strategic. Politically, she was sharp, so sharp, independently of her talent, which was, I mean, impossible to describe, you know. But
I mean, and we should also say that there's a Virginia Danielson for English speakers has written a very good biography of her, like a much fuller one, which I cite in the book. But I now, and it was also turned into a documentary, and I now forget what the documentary and the biography have slightly different names, and I forget which is which. But yeah,
and there is another book also a little bit more recent from Laura Lohman. Yeah, from her later years of Kulthum. Interesting. Let me read a little bit more of the chat so that I don't lose track. So Joe Langley says, clearly women are a main focus of the book. Yes, they are. How much do you probe questions of gender in the book? It seems from early discussions here that masculine and feminine qualities were presented from quite an essentializing perspective. Is there any allowance for a constructionist perspective?
I mean, yeah, I think issues of gender in the 20s and 30s in Egypt are such a hot topic. You can't ignore them. And I think what a lot of these women on stage are doing are probing at the boundaries of them. And I think, you know, I said about Munira Mahdir that one of the things she's doing is you know, perhaps poking fun at people calling her masculine. But another thing she's doing, and I think all cross-dressing is doing, is saying that these boundaries between genders are in some ways constructions. And one thing which I haven't, you know, I didn't manage to put that much in the book, but have written about very sort of briefly, is that this period in Egypt in the 20s and 30s is a time when the newspapers are obsessed with this idea of gender fluidity, and particularly and there's a lot of articles, I mean, at least 5 or 6 that I've seen about trans people, and they, you know, they're not always sort of extremely positive articles, but they're also not extremely negative articles. They're more, you know, a large full-page story about one, for instance, is in Sudan. They say, oh, here's a woman who's become a man. And speaking of Ezbekaya specifically, there's an article about a trans woman who is arrested by the police, or sort of taken in by the police, because they can't really arrest her for anything because she hasn't committed a crime. But they sort of take her in and question her, force her to admit that she was born a man, and then sort of let her go. And the press at the time is sort of quite obsessed with stories like this. And I think it all ties into what's going on in the 1920s, perhaps globally what's going on in the 1920s, actually, of these questions about what gender is, which are tied to so much stuff. You know, it's partly tied to a woman's place in the public sphere, but it's also tied to much more than that. And it's something I've given a few references to in the book and talked about a little bit, but I think it would take a lot more work to really write something more fully about it. But there's definitely something is going on there.
And talking about gender, I'm going to read a little bit from something that you wrote on Tauhida Carioca. Edward Said, the famous author, he became very famous for the book Orientalism, interviewed the Tauhida Carioca at some point. So I'm going to read a little bit of what you shared in the book to be legal. Otherwise, the police can come into your apartment and arrest you. So it's not that extraordinary that dancers get married a lot, okay? Edward Said, so the author of the famous Orientalism, who came back to Cairo in 1990 to meet Tauhida for an article in the London Review of Books, repeated that old question. She sat up straight, voice taking on the brassiness one associates with a lady of the night. I love that. Her eyes and her tone seem to add, so what? I've known lots of men. Do I need to say more? Let me read a question from Alauddin. Did Egypt's divas such as Kulthum and Munira al-Mahdiya have access to Egypt's diverse non-Arab communities, especially Europeans who knew little Arabic, if any?
My short answer would be yes, but the long answer would be it's complicated. So a lot of the entertainment at the time was very cosmopolitan, even the Arabic-speaking entertainment. And when you look at things like Naguib Rahani, his plays and his theatre company, who is someone who appears numerous times in the book, once as Badi'a Masabni's brief husband, he was running this kind of what was called the Franco-Arab Review, which was a mix of kind of Arabic and French and other European languages, all sort of thrown together on stage. And the performers really came from a huge variety of backgrounds, even though the sort of main language was Arabic always. So and I think there's a view sometimes that European and Arabic people didn't mix at all in the 1920s and 30s. There was, two separate cultures. And one of the things I'm trying to show with this book is that there was quite a lot of mixing, and mixing in an Arabic-speaking environment, not just in a French-speaking environment. So yes, but you sometimes read, for instance, the Francophone press at the time, and you can see that there clearly were a lot of people who weren't really interested in Arabic culture at all, who, all of the entertainment and theatre they're really interested in Paris. There's one article in Le Magazine Egyptien, which is a very long-running Francophone Egyptian magazine, where they send a correspondent to one of the Franco-Arab reviews, and they said they couldn't understand anything because they didn't speak any Arabic. So yes, there was a lot of mixing in, cosmopolitan mixing amongst the groups amongst performers, but that doesn't mean that everyone was hanging out together. I think there were a lot of, particularly in the 20s and 30s, there were a lot of societal, racial, and class divisions, which most people didn't surmount.
I love the mention of the jazz musicians.
Yeah.
I love that. It's so unexpected, right? A pair of Americans from the south of USA, jazz musicians working in Cairo at the time. Guys, you have to understand also at this time, Cairo was a very exciting place to be for anyone in the world. It's not like nobody was interested in it. It was quite cosmopolitan. It was varied. It was dynamic. It was an open door, not only to a different culture, but to this possibility of a future. Actually, I'm gonna read one last bit of your book, something that I consider so important, and we would be here forever because, as I told you, I had to quit. I had written here so many notes to ask you, and there will be no time to ask you about everything because every chapter raises different questions. So I'm gonna read a little bit of the end, and of course, I'm hoping everyone will read the book. I read it like in 2 days, in bam, bam, in 2 strikes, because I really loved it. And of course, these are about women that I know and that I love. And I really appreciated your perspective and how respectful and careful you were telling their stories. So this is at the end of the book, guys. After all, in early 20th century Cairo, life was never likely to be easy for these women. They faced disparagement, prejudice, even violence, and they were sexualized by men who wanted to either possess or police their bodies. For most people, especially women, the golden age of Cairo was no utopia. Nonetheless, in the years after the 1919 revolution, Egypt offered something intangible but vital: possibility. The female stars whose lives are set down in this book represent the promise, hope, and opportunity of the interwar period. There was a space for women to make their voices heard. Some triumphed, some failed, and some fell afoul of the law while doing it, but all of them were navigating a new world. That sense of possibility is what makes this period so compelling. I love that. You summed up the golden era so well. And it's one of the reasons why I keep coming back to this period in terms of dance, also, I mean, technically, in terms of influences, but also in terms of how much it is possible to change through the arts. So there is an underlying message for me, maybe because I'm a professional dancer, I don't know, an underlying message that through the arts, a disruption can be made through the fact that women stand up and they have their own voice and they do their own thing. And not only do they become actresses and singers, but impresarios, theater owners, business people, all of these areas that are not generally associated with women, and how that stepping up and doing things their own way can change society. It
Yeah, I
can
mean,
totally change.
you summed it up better than I could. The arts are a disruption. I think that's
It is beautiful. And at some point, you know, in the beginning of the book, this is another quote, I'm not going to read it, but you mentioned something about this golden era and this mix between an association that was made between the primitive, exotic side of dance and the modern approach that we see in the golden era. This mix that you often find also in the descriptions of the travelers of the time between this more primal side of Egyptian culture, music and dance, and at the same time, how disruptive it can be. They don't use the word modern because I think at the time, probably nobody used the word modern, but they describe it as disruptive, as an agent of chaos, fitna, as something that shakes things and in a good way or in a bad way changes things. Would you agree with that?
I mean, the art changes things. I think, yeah, and
Yeah. Not only the art, but the fact that women at this time, as in any other time, start to take the roles that are usually associated with men, like being the boss, like Badiama Sabni, she owned the bloody clubs. She was not a hired dancer. These women, a lot of them took things into their hands and say, you know what, I want to make the rules. I don't want to be a hired dancer, just a hired dancer. I don't want to be a hired singer. I'm going to buy the damn thing and I'm going to make the rules. This is revolutionary. Probably at the time, I don't know, they may have been doing it for money, for autonomy, for safety, for many reasons. But as we look back, this is revolutionary, even today.
Yeah, and yeah, I think that's what I also partly what I mean by what makes this period so exciting is the sort of possibility and the idea that the future might belong to Badiama Sabni or whoever it might be, whoever could seize it. And that's even though, and we didn't manage really to get onto this, but like even though women had many fewer rights than now in the 1920s, I think by any kind of measure of it. What was there was that sense of possibility and a sort of sense of possibility that's lacking a bit now in the 21st century Middle East, or perhaps in the 21st century world. But
so my last question would be, what do you think from that golden era remained and what went backwards?
I think it's sort of all remained, and it's that same push and pull. I mean, as you were saying before, you see so much stuff in these stories which just repeats and repeats over in sort of very similar patterns, and repeats around the world too, and that this sort of push back against the patriarchy or whatever you want to call it, is the same almost then as now. And that's really, and maybe that's why, one of the reasons why it's such a compelling story. One of the reasons why, in Egypt now, people are really getting much more interested in this period. I think probably than ever before in the past 10 years or so, people have really started to get interested in it. And perhaps that's one of the reasons that, people see in it some of the same struggles that they're fighting now, and want to see different ways of approaching it, and how things can be different. And I think that's, I guess, what also makes this period so interesting, is that there's a sense that things can be different.
I can see, a lot of the conquests of the golden era thriving. Legally, for once, legally. And I can see a lot of the things that you describe in the book in relation to how women were treated, how artists were treated, how dancers and actresses and singers were treated, that remain exactly the same. And the corrupted system, and the way you have to be intertwined with the police and know your way around and be very savvy. It's just exactly the same. The venues are different. And of course, the venues you describe in the book are nowadays, the ones that still exist are nowadays very shabby, very low level nightclubs that you go to for curiosity. You don't go there to see a great show anymore. So there are the remains of this great era there. But then you have different venues, different 5-star places, but the rules and the prejudices remain the same. Although the laws may have changed, and of course nowadays there are many ways to arrive to Cairo and make your name there. Many ways, just as it happened in this period, But I can see how much of the golden era remained and bloomed, and how much went actually backwards. How much was taken away, including the glamour and the interest. It's not there anymore, not the way we witnessed in the golden era. So it's also interesting to see the history of Egypt with advancements and how do you say it in English? When you go back, there are movements of advancement and movements of going back, and then advancements and then going back. It is not a straight line. It is not like, okay, from here, we're only going to go forward and everything is going to get so much brighter and more intelligent and fair and more justice for everybody. No, Egypt's history, it's made of so many intricate movements, and going back, going in, going up, it's very interesting, very dynamic, and always adventurous, always adventurous. You reminded me in the book of the police of morality for dancers, who at the time must have been very funny and very extreme. It still exists in Cairo. You're still taken, if you are a dancer under contract, you're still taken to the Ministry of Tourism, which is the ministry that rules the dance field, and you are made to sign a document that says, I will compromise, I commit on not wearing revealing clothes on stage. I commit to not doing lewd movements on stage, provocative. I swear, I'm not making this up. It's still there. You still have to sign it. As a dancer, when you sign a contract, you're still gonna go tested every year for HIV just because you're a dancer.
It was in 1910s, if you're an actress, it was you had to sign a contract saying you wouldn't go to a cafe after the performance.
Not
Like
surprised.
hang out late at night in cafes.
Yeah. Not surprised at all. Now, guys, some of you are asking about the book. I already shared the link to the book in one of the emails I sent you, but I will share it again with pleasure, okay? So I'm going to share the link to the book again, and I'm going to share the names of the women featured in the book, all right? So that you have the references. Now, last question. First of all, would you like to touch any subject I didn't touch?
Oof. I'm too tired for that. I mean, I'd like to hear more about your experiences dancing, but I think that's for another time.
Well, that will be for another webinar because I have a lot.
Someone asked if it's going to be.
You know, a lot of what you describe here in relation to everything, I lived it as a dancer nowadays. So it is not. I don't see it as a thing of the past. It is, as I said, very much part of the present, even in legal terms. One of the reasons why I was so surprised with the story of Fatma, and the Hoda Shaharawi and the son, is that I know the laws nowadays in Egypt. Although they are a little bit better than they were, it's still such a feat for a woman to be able to pull what she pulled off back then, even today. You know, so
there was a similar case as well, which I mentioned in the book very briefly.
Yes,
that happened in early. Yeah,
it is amazing. It is amazing how far we have come in Egypt, and how little things have changed at the same time. You know, the way dancers are seen, the way musicians are seen, the hierarchies, the way you're treated differently if you are in charge of your orchestra in a good place, or if you are a hired dancer. All of those dynamics, they're still there. You know, the way you're considered as a dancer. You know, I once had a very funny meeting with a house owner I was gonna rent. Then this lady told me, you know, I didn't know you were a dancer. Now I'm thinking twice, should I rent you the apartment? Because I gotta tell you, this is a family building. I cannot have parties all night, every night in your apartment. I said, lady, I work every night. Even if I wanted to, you will have more time for that and more energy than I, because I'm working all the time, and it's not going to happen. It's more probable that you are going to have these parties every night than I'm gonna. As she was shocked, you know, how can you tell this to me? Haram, Aib. This is very rude, very rude. No, why am I rude to give back to you the comment that you offered me so naturally just because I'm a dancer, you know, a ra'asa? So it's a lot has not changed, more than you would think. You know, maybe the outside, the exterior looks a little bit more modern and open, but when you're living it from the inside, you see the golden era is still there in other with other clothing, with other aspects, but the core is still there. Now I have one last question for you, Raphael, to close the webinar, which is one of my favorite questions. What books would you recommend aside from your own? Okay, I love this. And guys, grab your pen. Well, would you recommend something?
I mean, I will say that at the back of the book, there's a very long list of recommended books, because there's and it's complicated because there's quite a lot of stuff written in both Arabic and French on the subject, which I've given some of those references, but I won't give them now because I'm not going to assume everyone speaks Arabic and French, but maybe I'm going to assume everyone speaks English, and say that, well, one book I really liked is Ordinary Egyptians by Ziad Fafni, which maybe you won't know about. And that's kind of his take on that is basically a popular history of the 1919 revolution. And he goes into he's more looks at before the 1920s and looks at the 1910s in particular. But he talks about, Munira Mafdeh, he talks about various other singers and actors, particularly less dancers. And that's a really fun book. It's
Ordinary Egyptians by
Ziad Fahmi. I'll write that in.
Ziad Fahmi.
I think that's how he spells it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Guys, I will share that with you, okay? I will find it and share the reference with you.
That gives as well. That's a recent book out by Carmen Gitre called Acting Egyptian, which is mostly focused on Naguibah Raheni, but that's also quite a lot of 1920s stuff. I'm just getting into my my list of reading. I mean, books that you will know. I know Karen Van Newkirk you interviewed. That's a great book. And she's more focused on contemporary, or at least for when she wrote.
I had her at a webinar. She's amazing.
Yeah, and her sort of very brief history of Egyptian dance. Although it's not the focus of the book. That's probably the best thing written in English, I think, about the history of dance in Egypt, or at least that I've read.
A trade like any other. Of that period, yeah, it's absolutely the best. There's no doubt. It's very accurate and very well researched. There is another book, Raphael, that you may know that is specifically related to the Golden Era. It's in French. I have shared with our students at my school. It's Ennui au Mézières.
Yeah, I like that book a lot.
It's very nice and very entertaining. So guys, if you read French, I'm going to share this one. A lot of you already know about this book. If you're in the Golden Era course with me, you already heard me speaking about this book. But for the ones who are not, Ennui au Mézières. I don't think there is in English. I don't think
no, but there is in Arabic.
There is in Arabic as well. Yeah, of course. She's Arabic. She's Lebanese, a Lebanese author.
Yeah, and also if you read French, Frédéric Lagrange writes great stuff. His academia.edu page, I think he puts basically everything on it. I'll see if I can get a link now. He writes a lot about singers mostly, rather than dancers, but he's written some articles in English, but mostly French, and I think some in Arabic. But he's also involved in the Amar Foundation, whose website actually is great. Who they sort of find old Arabic records. It stands for Arabic Music Archiving and Research. It's based in Beirut, I think. Wow. And they put together. They've got a lot of. They release records, like remastered stuff, but they also have some music just on their website, which is a good place to look. Also, if you have Spotify, there's a good album. I mean, for people who like to listen to the music, even though the quality is not always utterly the best for these 1920s records, but there's Women of Egypt. There's Women of Egypt, I think 1924, I think to 1931. It was a record made reasonably recently by Amira Mitchell. It's got a subtitle, which I forget. Mm-hmm. That's on Spotify. And that's a good...
Oh, that's wonderful.
Songs on that.
Thank you. Yes, that is incredible. Guys, I'm not sure if you're pointing this out. Raphael is sharing these references with us in the live chat. I'm taking notes so I can share them with you via email as well. Okay. And I just want to thank you, Raphael. It was really hard for me to prepare. I must tell you this. Every time I have a guest, obviously I prepare differently depending on the person and what we're focusing on. And it was so hard because every little bit of your book rose questions. And maybe because so much of what you write about is part of my life and part of my experience in another period of time, you know, in another parallel reality, let's say, I had a great difficulty in narrowing down the things I was going to ask you, but I feel we gave an overview on the book. I feel we touched some of the aspects of the book that I find more interesting, and also we shared some thought-provoking notes that everyone will take and will grab and use in their own way. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me on. Just very briefly, because someone asked if there's going to be a Spanish translation. I don't know.
Yes. Dana asked.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I don't know. It's published by Saki Books, and I'm guessing they're trying to get translations, but I don't know how far along they've come.
Okay. Yes, it was Pilar. It was Pilar and Dana. They asked about the Spanish. Okay. Thank you again, Raphael. All the success. I hope you go back to Cairo, keep doing your work, you keep digging. Thank you for giving these women a voice.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah. Okay. Blessings and thanks everyone who watched this live, who was here with us, and the ones who are going to watch the replay. Enjoy.